thank you all. I'd like to thank Dr. Schmidt and the other organizers of this conference for their kind invitation and for the wonderful Hungarian hospitality. It's a great honor to be here with you. I know it's been 2 very long days, so I'll try to take up as little of your time as I can. When we stand back and look at Europe's position today, I think it's worth keeping in perspective that perhaps 140,000 languages have been spoken on planet Earth since the dawn of man. Fewer than 7,000 are spoken today, though most of these really are dialects. Most of them are going to disappear in the course of the present century. Perhaps 500 languages, most of them spoken by the remnants of Aboriginal peoples, have only a handful of elderly speakers. Now, are we so different from the extinct peoples of the past? In another century, the viability of major European languages will be in doubt. We stand at the cusp of the greatest wave of cultural extinction in human history. We do not know how many such extinctions occurred in the past. Unlike the dinosaurs, dead cultures left no fossils. Of the scores of thousands of dead languages, we have records of only 75 formally spoken between the Atlantic Ocean and the Black Sea. And here I plotted the projected population decline and fertility rate for the major European countries. At the bottom is Bulgaria, which in the UN population low variant will lose 70% of its population by the end of this century. At the top is Germany, which will only lose about half its population. And of course, those who remain will be quite old. We know that one of these great extinctions occurred at the end of the Bronze Age, around 2100 BCE. Another one followed the collapse of the Roman Empire. These occurred through invasion and slaughter. What makes today's cultural extinction unique is that most of the world's peoples have willed themselves out of existence. This, in my view, makes a mockery of liberal political theory, which regards the society as a voluntary association of individuals who accept the laws of a state that in turn protects individual rights. It also exposes the inadequacy of the so-called communitarian response, which asserts that the state is held together by the loyalties of affinity groups. Never before in human history have individuals been guaranteed so many rights. Never before have communities had so much freedom to form their desired identities. Nonetheless, the citizens of modern liberal democracies turn away from life in disgust. Nietzsche's Zarathustra spoke contemptuously of the last man. We risk becoming the last men of the West in the literal sense of the word. Now, demographic decline is not uniquely or even mainly a Western phenomenon. East Asian birth rates are as low as in Eastern Europe. Muslim countries that have made the transition from traditional society to modernity show fertility rates below replacement. In 1979, for example, the average Iranian woman had 7 children. Today, the number is only about 1.6. Iran has the fastest aging population ever recorded by the demographers. In a single generation, parts of the Muslim world have shifted from pre-modern to post-modern conditions of life. As a gauge of modernity, literacy is the best predictor of fertility rates in the Muslim countries. Islamic countries appear to leap from infancy to senescence without passing through adulthood. And here I've plotted for the Muslim world literacy rate versus fertility. It's about a 60% fit. We observe social pathologies in the present great extinction unlike anything in earlier ones. There have been nations that declined through infertility. Sparta in the 5th century BCE, reported already by Aristotle. Hellenistic Greece in the 3rd and 2nd centuries, reported by Strabo and other Roman historians. Despair today has impelled nations at war to fight on long after hope of victory has vanished until the reserves of manpower are exhausted. But never before in human history have very large numbers of individuals killed themselves to terrorize enemy civilians, as in the case of today's jihadists. And never before in human history has a combatant sought to maximize casualties among its own civilian population, for example, in the case of Hamas during the Gaza War of 2014, or the more recent incidents at the Gaza border with Israel. These unwelcome innovations arise from the suddenness of cultural decline. What Emil Durkheim called anomic suicide has become a mass phenomenon. So we ask if Europe has a future. If it does, I believe its future lies with what we might call the new nationalism. The European states were not concocted in the laboratory of liberal political theory, nor did they arise from mere agglomeration of tribes, as in the communitarian model. Tribal society does not require a state. In Papua New Guinea, you have nearly 1,000 languages, each spoken by an average of a few thousand people. Tribal society fractures into small affinity groups. It doesn't form a state. The European states arose from the ruins of Rome with a sacred purpose around monarchies founded in emulation of the biblical kings of Israel under the guidance of the leaders of the church. The Merovingians under the guidance of St. Gregory of Tours, the Spanish Visigoths with St. Isidore of Seville, and of course, St. Stephen of Hungary. After the fall of Rome, the church turned the Germanic, Slavic, and Magyar invaders into Christian European kingdoms, as the English historian Father Adrian Hastings showed in his 1996 book, The Construction of Nationhood. Hungary is the definitive European story. The original Magyar invaders who came as a scourge became Christianized and formed a kingdom and became the border guard of Europe for 1,000 years. The new nationalism has yet to find a clear message and a clear philosophy. It emerged in response to specific irritations. European Union meddling in the UK, hollowed-out manufacturing and surging immigration in the United States, the migrant wave in Germany, and so forth. But there's a far deeper motivation for the nationalist resurgence. We could see this last November in Poland, when 60,000 nationalists marched through Warsaw, many under signs declaring, "We want God." Polish nationalism, to be sure, includes chauvinist and anti-Semitic elements at the fringe, but the religious fiber that set Poland in opposition to the Soviet Union is not yet extinguished. The spiritual center of the Catalan nationalist movement lies at the ancient Benedictine monastery of Montserrat. There are, of course, economic grounds for Spanish sentiment, separatist sentiment in Catalonia, and the Catalans would certainly rather spend their money at home than send the money to Madrid, but tax grievances did not motivate Catalans to interpose themselves between the ballot boxes and the Guardia Civil during the October 1st, 2010 referendum and sustain hundreds of injuries in the confrontation. The same conventional wisdom that deprecates the new nationalism was shocked by the Brexit vote and the Trump victory in the United States. The nationalist protest vote in Germany has left the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, in political isolation, but it has so weakened the reigning Volksparteien that Germany was hard put to assemble a coalition government. Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Austria have elected nationalist governments that have dug in their heels against the European Union's immigration policies. Donald Trump's election stemmed in part from an economic protest vote, notably in the Rust Belt states of the the northern Midwest. But Trump also got a higher proportion of the evangelical Christian vote than any other candidate in American political history, by a margin of 80-16 among white evangelicals. He also won overwhelmingly among America's small but indicative community of Orthodox Jews, which I belong to. These are all manifestations of what is commonly called the identity crisis of the West, but might better be called the West's struggle with the sacred. By the sacred, I mean that which endures beyond our lifetime and beyond the lifetime of our children. The enduring characteristics that make us unique and will continue to distinguish us from the other peoples of the world, and which can't be violated without destroying our sense of who we are. The sacred is what a country's soldiers are willing to die to protect. Unless there's something for which we are willing to die, we will find nothing for which we are willing to live. And just as a statistical exercise, I took the results of a poll among European countries, the percentage willing to fight and die for their country, and plotted it against the total fertility rate. And as you would imagine, there's a strong and statistically significant relationship, even not taking Israel into account. The top, by the way, is Finland at 74% willing to fight for their country. The bottom is Germany at 18%. It would be interesting to see what would happen if Finland were to occupy Germany. Tradition surely is part of this, but not every part of our tradition is sacred. We find within tradition elements that have prevailed through the ages and which we expect to prevail if our present existence is to have a purpose beyond our lifetimes. These elements of tradition cannot exist except through a nation. Contrary to Hillary Clinton, it does not take a village, but a nation to embody the language, customs, and ethos that found our identity. The invariant feature of the various expressions of nationalism on both sides of the Atlantic is an attempt to recapture the past in order to envision a future. Who we are depends on where we came from and where we expect to go. Our present, as St. Augustine argued, is a composite of memory and anticipation. Augustine famously took issue with Cicero's definition of a res publica. Cicero said it's an association founded in common interest. Augustine said it was founded on common love. Perhaps we could say even better that it's founded on awe and fear, specifically the fear that by violating the elements of tradition that defines us, we will lose ourselves. The new nationalism arose in opposition to the prevailing philosophy of modern liberalism, namely the assertion that every individual should invent his identity. Existence precedes essence in Jean-Paul Sartre's cartoonish existentialism, which for him meant that we can invent our own essence. Everything, including the most fundamental determinant of nature, namely gender, has now become a social construct. Tradition has become a black museum of past instances of racism, misogyny, and colonialism. We mean many things by the term globalism, but the psychic content of globalism is to leave not one stone of the past atop another. In the United States, this has been enshrined in law. In Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy's majority opinion to eliminate barriers to same-sex marriage, what Kennedy wrote in the decision was, the Constitution promises liberty to all within its reach, a liberty that includes certain specific rights that allow persons to define and express their identity. That's nonsense, but in America, it's the law of the land. The new nationalism proposes instead to return to the well of our national culture. But what is this? To rediscover the sacred, we must reach back a full 1,000 years to the foundations of modern Europe. Europe was born of a sense of the sacred. By the sacred, I mean simply the eternal, that which transcends our present conditions of life and gives us reason to believe that some part of our being will not perish. The pagan cults of the ancient world offered no such hope. The gods of Greece and Germany were immortal but not eternal. Zeus knew that a rival would destroy him as he had destroyed his father Kronos, and the Norse gods anticipated their doom at the Götterdämmerung, the Ragnarok. Families and tribes are fragile. The nation is the bearer of our immortality because the nation can last in a way that families and tribes by themselves cannot. That's why young men leave their families and sacrifice themselves in the battlefield to preserve their nation. In human history, the hope for eternity has a specific incarnation, and that is Israel, the eternal nation. It was the genius of Christianity to offer adoption into Israel to the tribes cut loose from their origin during the decline of Rome and to establish national monarchies modeled on the Davidic monarchy. The European monarchies were Europe's hope, but also its tragedy. The Catholic model of national monarchies subordinated to universal empire collapsed because the nations of Europe demanded an exclusive sort of election and perverted the original mission of the Church. This was embodied, for example, in the French idea of gestade per Francos. France is a uniquely chosen nation. A similar idea prevailed in Spain, and Spain and France fought this out during the 30 Years' War to extinction, the extinction of Central Europe. The Catholic imperial project collapsed during the 30 Years' War, which began as a Catholic-Protestant conflict and ended as a war between the French and Spanish dynasties. The national megalomania of France and Spain was mirrored in all the European powers. For example, in Dostoevsky's claim that Russia was the unique God-bearing nation, and ultimately, of course, in the Nazis' claim that the Germans were a master race, a concept that was a perverted version of the original idea of a chosen people. The old nationalism died with the two world wars of the past century. As an antidote, the Europeans proposed to eliminate the nation, to dissolve themselves into a transnational union that would stamp out national particularity. The cure is deadlier, if slower acting, than the disease. The Europeans aspired in the last century to be Nietzsche's Superman, and it said they became the last men. If you destroy a nation's sense of the sacred, you destroy its motivation to bring a new generation into the world. There's no going back to the old nationalism. Can a new nationalism flourish in its place? This, in my view, requires a return to Europe's biblical foundations with a renewed sense of the sacred. Israel, as I said before, has for 2,000 years embodied Europe's hope for eternity. The spiritual Israel of European Christianity misappropriated the biblical idea of election. Each of the European powers wanted to be elected, so to speak, in its own skin, and the Europeans, as Franz Rosenzweig put it, were unable to tell Jesus from Siegfried. That's the most pernicious source of historic Jew hatred in Europe. The European obsession with national election in the flesh led the Europeans to despise, expel, and ultimately destroy the remnant of the people whom, according to the Bible, God first chose for himself. The restoration of the actual physical Israel, the nation-state of the Jewish people, should be a sign of hope for all nations. Israel's mission is to be a light unto the nations, an exemplar and paragon, as Rosenzweig said, that incorporates the sacred into the daily life of a people. The nations of Europe will rise up from the valley of dry bones when they are able to grasp what is sacred and their own character and encourage the efforts of their neighbors to do the same. I'm very taken, by the way, with the slogan, all for one, and one for all. Dumas had no idea what he was dealing with when he came up with that. Through Christianity, Israel came to embody the desire of the nations. Today's Israel should be a beacon for nations that are struggling to maintain their identity and cohesion against a demographic ebb tide and against the pressures of globalization. Let me say one thing off record about European anti-Semitism. The American evangelicals famously are the great supporters of Israel. Their grandfathers were the worst anti-Semites in the United States. They're the ones who told Franklin Roosevelt not to take in too many Jewish refugees during World War II, or they'd vote for the Republicans. After the 1967 war, the evangelicals were convinced they had witnessed a miracle, and they wanted to be on the right side of it, and they became great philo-Semites. So when some of my co-religionists worry about residual anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, I told them, look at the evangelicals and look at the way that the Eastern Europeans have allied with Israel and what an inspiration Israel can be for small nations who are also struggling to succeed. Is there hope for Europe? Well, the odds don't look good, but they also look bad when the Ottomans occupied Hungary in the 17th century. They look bad when the Germans and then the Russians occupied Hungary in the middle of the 20th. Never in history did the extinction of a people appear as probable as in the case of the Jews in 1944. Yet only 4 years later, the Jewish state arose from the ashes, and Israel has become a demographic miracle, an exception that proves the rule. Humankind cannot bear mortality without the hope of immortality. The hope of immortality, in turn, is founded on a sense of the sacred. The true history of the world is the history of mankind's search for immortality. Nothing is inevitable about the numbers I showed you before. One of the most remarkable recoveries is Russia's demographics. Never anything like that on record, from a low of about 1.2 children per female to 1.7, pretty much the same as the United States in 15 years, and it corresponds to a revival of Christian faith. Only 30% of Russians identified as Orthodox Christians right after the fall of communism. Now the number is above 70%. For women, it's above 80%. I don't mean to recommend the Russian model. I have certain worries about Russian messianism, but nonetheless, Russia is a demonstration that nations can recover from demographic catastrophe, and that this is associated with a return to national character and religious faith. What is inevitable is that a drastic shift in the concentration of the world's population of young people will occur to Africa and a little bit to South Asia. By the end of the century, Africa will, at present rates of increase, comprise 4/5 of the world's population aged 20 to 30 years. The refugee wave of the past few years is tiny compared to what is coming. If the European nations don't draw a line at mass immigration now, they'll be swamped. But if they fail to revive their national sense of purpose and their willingness to bring new generations into the world, only a dwindling population of old people will be there to await the inevitable. The Germans, even people like Angela Merkel, will at some point draw the line and keep the refugees out. You might as well start now and avoid the social consequences that Germany is already suffering. I don't mean to sound hard-hearted, but the best thing you can do for failing cultures is don't be one of them. There's still a chance for Europe to create a future worthy of its glorious history, but it won't last for long, and it won't come again. Thank you very much.